So welcome to tonight's constitutional conversation. Our guest tonight, I think, has got to be one of the most interesting men in California. Charlie Munger, who, by the way, those of you who might live in the Charlie Munger dorms may be interested to know that's Charlie's father.
That's my dad.
So Charlie went a rather different course. He did not go to run Berkshire Hathaway. Instead, he became an atomic scientist and worked at the Stanford Accelerator, and I don't even know what else. I wouldn't be able to understand it if I did know. But he's also been extremely active in politics of a particular sort. So he won the Common Cause Award, National Civic Leader Award a few years ago, which is very typical of the sort of work that he does, which has to do with trying to find solutions to our political, gridlock and polarization by coming up with new ways of dealing with some of the problems like redistricting and primary elections and so forth. And when I say active, he actually sits down and with his considerable mathematical skills has come up with these reform proposals himself. In fact, I remember talking to Charlie as he was doing this, and I'm thinking, well, you don't get experts to help. No, Charlie is the expert who actually has done the work, and then he has financed the referenda, and now he's going to tell us with the kind of dispassionate clarity that only an experimental scientist can probably bring how well it has worked. And I am extremely curious to find out. So please join me in welcoming Charlie Munger.
I will modify that excellent introduction only by saying that indeed I had some of the best advice in the land. But you sometimes get two experts who disagree about how something should be written and what the political consequences and long-term consequences of the state will be if you do it one way or the other. And at that point, when I said the language should be this way, that is the way it was written. And if we had a legal challenge and we had a brief to file, lawyers might argue, but if I said, I think we should make it this argument rather than that one, that is the way it was. So I'm here to talk to you mostly about results. So I'm not going to go instantly into all the legal arcana. I'm going to tell you what happened, because we've actually passed this set of reforms. We've had TopTwo primary in California for a decade. We've had the effects of redistricting reform in California for a decade. And the other thing that I had a great deal to do with was government transparency, that there is now a constitutional requirement that for a house of the California legislature to move a bill out of its house, the bill has to be in final form on the internet, available to everyone, and in particular to the legislators who have to vote on it, for a minimum of 72 hours. The other thing it says is if you hold a public hearing of the legislature on a bill to discuss its merits, and people come up and say, I like it or I don't like it, and here's why, that entire hearing has to be audiovisually recorded and posted on the internet for a minimum of 10 years for anyone to go back and see, what did you really say when that was passed? So I did that too. But my primary action here is to talk about the TopTwo primary and its results and redistricting reform and its results. So to proceed, what the heck is a TopTwo primary? All right. 10 years ago in California, we had a system of so-called partisan primaries for our state offices. State legislature, that's the Assembly and the State Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, and for the various state offices, except with the exception of things like the Superintendent of Public Instruction, they were also partisan offices. And the system there was, if you were a voter, you found this, is that when you came to the primary election, which would decide who advanced to the general election to appear before the general electorate, no voter had the authority to vote for one candidate of one party in one race and turn around and say, I want to vote for another candidate of another party in a different race. That was legally impossible. The political parties that had enough registration to be so-called ballot qualified, they each got one slot in the general election ballot. And they were given two promises. One is, if one of your candidates runs for that office, they are going to be on the general election ballot. I don't care how few voters voted for them. The second one is that only one will get there. You will never have two of your party vying it out before the general electorate. The decision between those two candidates will be made in the primary. And in particular, it'll be made by a very specialized electorate. Namely, if you are a Republican, you will face only voters registered with the Republican Party. If you belong to some other party, you cannot by law vote in that. If you are an independent, or declined to state voter you might call them, you can vote in that party primary only if the Republican Party chooses to allow it. You're there only on their sufferance. And if you think that's a dead letter, at present, if you want to vote for elections that aren't covered by the top two, being U.S. president, if you're an independent, you can go vote in the Democratic primaries for all the Democratic candidates for office in the upcoming election. You can't vote for any of the Republican candidates because the Republican Party threw you out of its primary for the U.S. Senate. Excuse me, for the presidency. I misspoke. If you want to vote for anyone for Assembly or State Senate, you still can. But you can't do it for the presidential race because the Republican Party decided you shouldn't do that. And that rule was the case in California for all the offices. All right, so what's a top two primary? Well, that's what you're familiar with when you vote for some office like a city council race for San Jose. All the candidates who want that city council race all appear on one ballot. Multiple people of different parties or of no party, doesn't matter. When you want to go up and vote for one of them, you just vote for them. It doesn't matter what your party affiliation is. It doesn't matter whether you have a party affiliation. And very critically, no political party can turn to any voter and say, we don't want you voting for one of our candidates in that primary. I'm sorry, if there are two Republicans there, the Republican Party has no authority to say, well, I think you're unreliable. You vote for the wrong one. We don't want your opinion, and neither does the Democratic Party. So that's how the top two primary actually works. It's a reform. A reform of what? What was the problem with the partisan primary system? And this is the claim. Over the decades in California, the candidates who reached the general election under partisan primaries were all uniformly less representative of the people they were supposed to be representing, namely the general election voter in the district, particularly in seats that were overwhelmingly safe for one other party. That's the claim. There are several things that came together to create that result over decades. One of them was that there was just declining voter participation in the primary. Fewer and fewer people elected to vote in the primaries. They voted in the general, but they didn't show up for the primary, so it was a less representative electorate. There's a rising fraction of voters who choose to register with neither major political party, and of course they faced large barriers to entry to participating in anybody's primary because, for one thing, they can be told, you're not welcome, and the second one is there were other barriers to keep them from voting even when they were nominally welcome. California, like many places, started getting separated geographically by party. You were more likely to live in a district that was overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat than you were in a district that was half and half. So there were a rising number of safe seats. And safe seats had a bad effect on the elections for the partisan primaries, because if it's a safe seat, everybody wants to run. Not everyone wants to run in a seat they're going to have to defend every 2 years, every 4 years. So you attract multiplicities of candidates. And as is well known, if there are 5 or 6 candidates running, you can win a plurality race in that primary with a very small voting fraction. So if there are 5 candidates running, you can be the plurality winner with 25%. Interestingly, that doesn't mean the general election voter likes you at all, and it doesn't mean that the other 75% of your own primary voters wanted you over the other people. It might mean that they wanted any of the other people over you, but that person never got a chance to see the general electorate. There was also a deliberate exacerbation of these latter two problems by a direct action of the legislature, which we'll take up when we hit redistricting reform. Okay, top two primaries. So what do they look like when you actually watch them happen? So what you're looking here is a histogram of various top two races for the state assembly. The horizontal axis measures basically whether that's a Republican or a Democratic district you're talking about. It measures the difference in the voting registration in that district the Republican Party had minus the registration the Democratic Party had. So at the extreme right, at 20, that's some district which say the Republicans had a 40% registration, the Democrats 20. You go off the other side, and yes, there are districts where the registration is upside down by more than 60 points. What you're seeing are the races that the top two yielded where it did what partisan primaries never did. It said we want two candidates of the same party. This district prefers one party so much that the two strongest candidates, measured by the votes that occur in the primary, were of the same party. What you see very interestingly is they segregate very naturally. You only get these races in districts which one party is overwhelmingly favored by voter registration. So, surprise, it's a D plus 20 district, and they want to choose between the two Democrats. They don't want a Republican. You got a Republican district that's R plus 10. They don't want to choose between a Republican and a Democrat. They want to choose between two Republicans. The first rule is you only get these top two races in districts where, in fact, there would be no real competitive election in a general election, absent the fact that you're now keeping both of the strong candidates there. They just happen to be of the same party. The vertical axis, interestingly, is the money somebody thought was worth spending to try to win an election that's not going to affect the partisan balance in the legislature. You're two Ds or two Rs. You're going to get a D and a D on D, and you get an R and an R and R. If you look at the top, there was an assembly race, Grayson versus Trollexon, that somebody thought was worth $11 million to fight over the issues between those two Democrats, because it turns out they agreed very profoundly on education policy in the state of California. But they agreed on a lot of things that Democrats like otherwise. But that one difference was enough to make that a matter where the general electorate had a pronounced view, and people thought they should fight over them. All right. How many of these D on D races and R on R races do we get in California? Answer: 6 years over the 3 election cycles of my study, there were 80 of them for state assembly, state senate, and the U.S. House. Okay. Of those 80 races, some of them are just blowouts. Incumbents running for re-election draw weak candidates to run against them. That was true in the era of partisan primaries, where if you were a powerful Democrat in a D plus 40 seat, you weren't too worried about being knocked out by some Republican contender. It's still true under the system of top two primary. So most of these races aren't competitive at all. So let's throw out the non-competitive ones as being, you can't create competition where there isn't any. So we're going to say a competitive race is one of two kinds. It's either where you have no incumbent at all, or where you have an incumbent, and the challenger of his own party that's trying to take him on is not outspent by more than 9-1. Okay, if you're outspent by more than 9-1 and you're trying to knock out an incumbent, you're a token. You subtract those 22, you wind up 58 races where somebody is trying to fight within a party to actually be the legislator, and we ask a question. In how many of those races was the person who took second in the primary, who would have been eliminated under the old primary system, actually turn it around and win the general, showing that in a head-to-head matchup, he represented the district better? Pause. 19 of the 58. More than a third of them. Put another way, the system of partisan primaries was actually eliminating the candidate. So in a head-to-head matchup, the district really wanted for those two. A lot of the time, they're only getting it right 65% of the time. Okay? Now, if you can identify the two strong candidates, and you just want a system that'll pick the strongest one, the one the general election wants, I've got a much simpler system that gets that right, albeit a full 50% of the time, which is that one. In other words, if you just flipped a coin, you would get the one right 50% of the time. So it's probably a good idea in these districts where the district votes and shows by saying the two top candidates are two Democrats, two Republicans. That's what we want to choose between. You don't eliminate one of them. In a partisan primary, you put both before the electorate, because that way you got the strongest candidate before the general electorate 100% of the time, not 65. So that's one of the big results of the top two. Another one is this one. 58 competitive same-party general elections. So how many incumbents were in them who ran and lost? 10. We knocked out 10 incumbents in same-party races. You do the breakdown. In one race, redistricting artifact. We redrew the lines. Two people battled each other in the primary. They were both had the office before. So you're going to knock that one out anyway. So that's not fair. 6 races, the incumbent led his challenger in the primary, but he lost the general. And in 3 races, the challenger actually led in the primary. So we've got 6 races where the general electorate said, we're willing to turn out an incumbent to get somebody else, if you'll only give us the chance. But in the primary, the challenger would have been eliminated. We never would have gotten a smell of him. Now, if you want to do a comparison, is 10 a big number? You can look at what happened in the 3 election cycles when we had partisan primaries and ask, same set of races, how often did you knock out an incumbent in a same party challenge? Well, in the top 2, we got 3 election cycles that I looked at. We got 10. Partisan primaries, 5 cycles, an entire decade, 3. So the number of times we've knocked out an incumbent in a same party challenge has gone up by about a factor of 6, which is a big change, and I think is desirable because the person knocking him out is being able to appeal to the entire electorate of a district, and representing that group is supposedly the point. Now, I think those are pretty interesting and valuable results, but there is a whole garden of myths about the top 2, which in fact are the subject of a very long paper that I wrote, which you are all welcome to peruse on your own. And I wrote these papers in order to analyze whether these myths were in fact correct. I'm a scientist, is what we do. So some people say that the top 2 has harmed the minor parties. Some people say it depressed the statewide voter turnout in the primary or the general. Some people say, oh, well, yeah, even if voters turn out and vote, when they come to a top 2 race, they skip it. They don't actually ballot it. So what's the point of having these races? Some people say, well, if I'm a Republican and it's 2 Democrats, I skip it. But if it's 2 Democrats, a Democrat will vote in it. So it has a partisan effect in who skips it. Some people say it's just bad to have general elections where you don't have D versus R. And I said there's no evidence for that if you look at national politics. Some people think that statewide races then in D&D suppress voter turnout by Republicans, and that's terrible, and that doesn't happen. Some people say Republican registration is falling in the state. Top 2 came in at about the same time as the fall, so it must be responsible. No. Democrats are spending a lot of money in these D&D races. It must be a plot to bankrupt the Democratic Party. It's biased in favor of the Democrats intrinsically, because after all, we were a more Republican state before you put the top 2 in. Now we're less, so obviously that's the reason Republicans are taking on the chin. None of this is supported by any of the facts. 0. And so I'll issue a challenge. If you think any of these things, ask me a question, and I will do my best to answer it, but I'm not going to go through every single one of these because I want to talk for 20 minutes and get on to what you want to talk about. But those are, and you can ask about anything else. Okay, and there's a long paper, 122 pages, 48 figures, 250 footnotes and references, full academic process. I'm a physicist. I know how to do that. It's all public. You can go look at it at your leisure, and if I say something controversial and you think he couldn't have said that, really, you can go look. And so you can go to the Schwarzenegger Institute and Google my name, and you'll find papers. Okay, redistricting reform. This is also an interesting story. The story of the battles over drawing the lines for Congress is epic. State legislatures, also epic. It's really rich. It's fragrant with human folly, but I'm not going to try to tell the entire story of that in California. I'm going to tell you what redistricting reform did in a way that you can see it with your own eyes in 2 figures. So, 1990s, districts in California for the U.S. House, State Assembly, State Senate were drawn by the California Supreme Court. Legislature deadlocked because you got a Republican governor, Democratic legislature. They want, and they couldn't agree on the maps. The result of that is that the districts in California for the ensuing decade and elections, 1992 through the election of 2000, were pretty reasonable, actually. Nobody was trying to bias the results by drawing the lines. Enter the legislature again in 2001, and they decided they would redraw the lines to achieve a particular result, which was there should be no districts anywhere in California that either party had a chance to win. Only one party could win. Competitive elections were to be banned, between the parties were to be banned by legislative fiat. Well, I'm not going to tell you that story because I can show it to you. So here you sit. What you're looking at is a histogram, again with voter registration on the horizontal axis. So this would be a heavily Republican district, that'd be a heavily Democratic district. This is a histogram of the 80 assembly districts just before the legislature got involved. And what you see is that they form a whale. Nice, smooth top distribution. And there are a bunch of of elections in the center bin, which is plus or minus 5% by registration. If you study state politics, 5%, one way or the other, is about the limit of a district that a candidate can win if he's really good and he runs a great race. Get beyond that, no can do. So these are the ones that any party can win. And the rest, these are safe Democratic seats. These are safe Republican seats. Not that the Supreme Court cared. They just drew the lines. And you see that you also get whale distributions for the U.S. House and for the state Senate. Enter the legislature. Most spectacular down here when you look at Congress. Here's the whale. There's the camel. And every single competitive congressional race in California vanished by legislative fiat. Literally in an hour when they passed the bill. It's not quite so bad for the state Senate. It's not quite so bad for the state assembly, but if you add that up, they killed off 25 competitive districts. So if you look at the politics in California from 2002 to 2010 and say it kind of gridlocked, I'm the one who's telling you that this partisan primary system tends to create unrepresentative legislators in safe seats, and now they're all safe. Very bad. Okay. We passed redistricting reform in California, so the legislature couldn't draw the lines in 2011. It was going to be done by an independent redistricting commission. So the commission, it was supposedly supposed not to look at Republican and Democratic voter registration. They were supposed to look at keeping communities of interest whole, keeping towns and counties whole if it could, blind to where the Republicans and Democrats were, blind to where the incumbents were. They drew the maps and they opened them, and this is what you see. The districts will have changed a little bit from now till the ones drawn by the legislature will have drawn because of demographic shifts over the decades, so they're not going to be quite the same shape, so they're in a different color. It's a darker green. Presto. Here's the U.S. House. This is what the legislative districts had turned into. It's still got a hole in it. It's moved a little bit to the left, that camel, because the whole state did. These are the districts that the commission came up with by partisan registration. You will notice there's no hole here. That's another whale. That Gaptoothed is also largely removed. This is considerably improved. They didn't do it because they wanted to create competitive districts. They just weren't deliberately trying to get rid of them. And so now we have, and will have, for the next election cycle, heaven only knows what will happen after that, competitive districts between the parties in California, where they always should have been. Right? And those are the principal results of the redistricting reform in the top two. And I'm happy to take questions on any and all of this from members of the audience. Thank you very much.
So we'll take questions. Just line up on either side, and we'll just alternate between left and right.
Better come up with a question, or I'm going to start talking again.
Question. I'm new to California,
Sure.
and isn't the whole top two vote thing based on a fiction that our state has Democrats and Republicans? It is a Democratic state, so It was it's built as if there are two parties. You started off by saying we have gridlock. We don't have any of that in California. It's a blue state. So I'm wondering if the whole thing is not based on a fiction, as if we have two parties, which we don't really.
My answer to that is, remember, I'm here to try to get a representative, Republican, Democrat, or none of the above, who really represents the general election vote of the district. In your model, okay, it's fine by me if there are no parties at all. You still have the problem of making sure that you get the most representative person. I was looking at the partisan primary system, which we had, and saying it is systematically avoiding getting a choice between the two most promising people, and therefore, you shouldn't allow the party identification of the two strongest candidates to kill one of them. If they're both two Democrats, let it be two Democrats. If they're both two Republicans, if it's one of each, which is what most elections are, so be it. But where a district really wants a choice between two of one party, or those are just the two strongest candidates for whatever reason, then I think they should get them. The best answer I can give you.
Thanks. I had a question sort of related to the interplay between the top two. I'm a student at the law school. I wanted to ask a question about the interplay between the two reforms. So It seems to me that the problem that the top two primary is trying to solve is when you have strong D or strong R districts that you're not going to have competitive general election. And so you're sort of trying to make the general more competitive by having a top two system, whereas redistricting is solving the problem that you have too many strong D or strong R districts. So I wonder if having the two reforms together, like each of the reforms on their own is very powerful, but the sum, it's like 1 + 1 = 1.5 instead of, because there's diminishing marginal returns to stacking the two reforms on top of each other. And I'm curious if you had thoughts there.
I think you're completely correct. In other words, however you draw the districts in California, you will have a majority of them being where the voters by registration are majority Democrat or majority Republicans. And in those districts, the top two often will make the party that's the dominant party in the district have a more representative member of the legislature. If you have a district that's in the middle, it's competitive between the parties, then what you wind up with is a D versus R general election, and we choose between the two of them, but nobody is going to say, by the way, my caucus in the legislature can't lose a seat no matter how crazy I vote, because there are no elections that we could lose to the other party, the other team. So the two together are run on separate tracks. They each deal with different parts of the problem. If we'd had no gerrymandered districts at all, ever, like in the 1990s, we would still have the need for a top two primary because so many of California's districts are one-party dominant, and you would like a legislature that was representative anyway. It will work after a fashion without doing it, because it doesn't matter if you have 40 people in the extreme left in the assembly and 40 people in the extreme right, as long as you have 20 people in the middle who form the voting majority on something who will actually talk to each other. It's like a knee. As long as you have some cartilage there, it works. If you eliminate all of it, then the legislature grinds, which is what happened when they removed the competitive seats between the parties in the 2000s. So, yes, I agree with you.
So one of the ultimate consequences of all this is you have legislators who are voting, and they have policy differences. And so with particularly the top two vote getters being in the same party, you would think that if the Ds are, the two Ds are running, the Republican voters in the district would sort of vote for the more conservative, moderate of the two, and if you've got two Rs running, the Ds in the district will vote for the more moderate or more liberal of the two. So I haven't seen anywhere in what you were talking about, sort of looking at the voting of the various members of the legislature after they're elected, but it strikes me that it's almost early to fully assess the impact because you've got still lurking incumbents that were around when these reforms came into place, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, that would be, 12 or 14 years to sort of cycle through all of the incumbents. So you've still got several more years till you can fully assess how effective these would be. But do you have any sort of interim assessment of how this has impacted legislation and the votes of the Assembly and State Senate?
It impacts it in a few ways. You don't see it if you ask how many decisions made by the legislature come down to a strict party line vote. If you're looking for Democrats to cross over and vote for Republicans and Republicans to cross over Democrats, you're counting the number of bills. You don't see it there. But that's because the bills are different. So I'll give you how the legislature works on this. There's a brief interlude. There was an interlude when the Republicans were below 2/3 in the legislature. And the Democrats said, great, we can start authorizing taxes. But they didn't because they had lost a few Democrats in the Senate due to scandals and whatnot. And they only wound up authorizing one. The next election cycle, the Republicans took back the 2/3 group in both the Assembly and Senate. And so you can ask, how many heroic votes to authorize taxes did that Republican minority, but over a third, have to make in order to fight down all the taxes the Democrats brought to the floor? 0, because no leader of the legislature will ever bring a big public vote he knows he's going to lose there, so they weren't brought. What you're watching with the top two is not so much that you don't get party line votes, but the party line votes you get are on very different bills than you would otherwise. The compromises are occurring in the back rooms. You do get some candidates who explicitly running as I'm a Republican, but I'm a Republican you Democrats can like because I think I can make it to the top two and then win and stay here. And you get Democrats who are doing the same thing. It's a minority of all legislators yet, but I think you're having a real effect on policy as well as simply numbers. And I'll come down. Are you next or no? You.
Charles, I heard you back in 2010 talking about Prop 14, the idea of making a more moderate legislature, which I fully supported. But instead, we seem to have a more radical legislature. It seems to be getting worse. And, I thought that where you'd have 2 Rs or 2 Dems coming in there, say if there's 2 Democrats running maybe the Republican Party would come in there and become the kingmaker, and I haven't seen any of that happen.
Well, the 2 things. One is it does happen in some districts. Steve Glazer is a state senator who is there because he's running to get Republican support. The party organizations, state Republican Party and Democratic Party organizations, loathe the top two. The Democrats practically foam at the mouth, and the Republicans have foamed at the mouth and are now merely sullen about it. And the reason that they do is because if you are active in a state party organization, you have a pretty clear vision, one way or the other, of where you think the state ought to go. And generally, you don't really care very much whether your point of view is representative of a district or not. If it's not representative of the district, so much the worse for the district. So you don't want a system whereby a large number of people may have a referendum between your candidate and another candidate in the general and lose your candidate, where if it had just been a partisan primary system because of vote splitting and low turnouts in different elections, you would actually have won that seat. So real power has shifted within the factions of the Democratic Party and, frankly, factions in the Republican Party because of the top two, because different Republicans are actually taking the offices. I wasn't on point to ask that question again.
Thank you for your work on this reform. I was wondering, you've seen some positive results from these 2 reforms, but how do you think that you could go further on these reforms? I'm from Australia. I know that we have quite a different electoral system in many ways to this. We have ranked choice voting, for example. Maybe that's representative, like proportionate representation as well in the Senate. I was wondering if you thought about any of these other sort of electoral forms, particularly voting.
Yes. The biggest thing that the top 2 did was it said that anybody could vote for anybody in the primary. That's a big change over the partisan primary system. And so many people have proposed that that's a great idea, but you should have a different system of actually doing the balloting. For example, instead of saying the top 2 people should read to general election, you should have the top 3 or 4, and then not have a plurality race, but have a ranked choice voting system. For example, some people favor, you'd rank each candidate, I like this one best, second, third, and fourth. We tally the first place finishes. If somebody gets a majority, great. If no one does, we drop the weakest candidate. His votes are reapportioned because their second place candidate is now deemed to be their first. You run through this until you finally find a winner. That's a complicated issue. There are people who are trying to get ranked choice voting systems like that with TopTwo, with anybody can vote for anybody, like the TopTwo. It's an open issue. I don't know how big the incremental improvement would be. I do know this, is that if you like the partisan primary system and you wanted to make it better, I would institute a ranked choice voting system in the partisan primary. So the claim that the problem that you have vote splitting and one guy with 25% wins even though the rest of them hate you won't happen quite as often would probably be a reform to go for. It's difficult only if you have 15 candidates who run, because then you're asking voters to rank 15 candidates, and many voters simply won't. I mean, I don't know. I mean, personally, I was voting in the Republican presidential primary, and somebody had asked me early on to rank, the sitting president and Ted Cruz. That'd be so far down on my list, I'm not sure I would have given a great deal of thought to the matter, although it turned out that was actually quite consequential. So those are the issues involved. But I'm sympathetic to the goals of ranked choice voting, but it's not clear to me that they've thought through everything completely, and it's not clear to me that incremental change is such that if I could raise my hand and institute in California, I would do so.
I think you almost answered the question I was going to ask.
Oh.
I'm not quite sure if you could finish your answer in the sense of why you came up with this scheme as opposed to ranked choice. How much you thought about it, and what just turned you off to one versus the other?
Sure, that's a very easy question. I didn't think about ranked choice voting at all when I wrote the TopTwo, because I didn't write it. It's one of the ones that I championed, but it was somebody else's idea and authorship. So if somebody had come to me at the time and said, do you want to do this and do ranked choice voting at all, I'd say that is trying to jump across a river in one step. That trying to persuade an electorate to make this big change and throw in ranked choice voting on top of it. At the California at the time, I would say if you try that, it won't pass. It was a fairly narrow victory as it was.
I guess the other question is, if you did the ranked choice, would you eliminate the primary?
That's a very interesting question. It's often put forward to say that we could just do ranked choice in one election cycle. I am very skeptical of that as a sensible idea, because the purpose of having multiple candidates running, often the electorate gets the real information about the relative worth of the top 1, 2, or 3 candidates only when there are 1, 2, or 3 candidates left. And the political factions only coalesce behind one candidate or another only when they know that their favorite son is not going to make it. And I think that's sort of a universal human tendency. Because of that, I like the idea of having the primary, choose the strongest candidates, and the general electorate can say, okay. Because it's a much easier thing, because it's okay if you rank the candidate that the general election really wants 4th in a ranked choice primary. He'll be on the general election ballot. We'll pay attention to them. You're not asking a whole lot of a ranked choice system there. If you want to pick the guy to be the legislature in that single go, that's asking a lot more. It's not completely clear to me that the ranked choice system is quite strong enough to do that. I don't oppose it, but I don't endorse it at this time.
Cool results. Thank you. I have 2 questions, if you can entertain them.
Sure.
One, piggybacking off the question of the effect on legislative outcomes. Mm-hmm. Have you done, or do you have any interest in doing a study on the effect of these reforms on nominate or CF scores of the assembly members, like the donor bases or the vote similarity between I guess, the aggregate nominate or aggregate CF scores of the assemblies?
I have not, because I'm not competent to do that. I'm pretty confident that when, under a top-2 system, if that you've got the person who best represents the district, whether that, because I didn't get into this gig in order to change the electorate, the legislature in a way that the voters in a district actually didn't want. I'm not here to stand up for a conservative legislature or liberal legislature, any kind of legislature. I want a representative. So it's fine by me if San Francisco wants to put in what some people would call a flaming liberal, and if the northeast corner of the state wants to put in some person who I would call a flaming conservative. It represents the district. If he beats his nearest challenger, he's got the imprimatur. I'm good with that. And I'll take whatever comes of it. Moderation per se is not necessarily a virtue. Representative government is, and in particular, moderation is a virtue only if the system is deliberately excluding people who should have been in the legislature who do happen to be moderates, and by some measure, just as much as it would be terrible for set up a political system that systematically removed all the liberals, removed all the conservatives. That would be terrible, and you don't have to have a point of view of which you like, liberal or conservative. You just say that's not going to be as good a democracy as if the points of view that are represented are the ones that are representative of the people in the district. That's my stand on it. Other people have said we want to restore the moderates to the legislature. That's true and it's false, in that part of the reason a lot of moderates went is because of redistricting reform, right? The redistricting gerrymanders, you deliberately got rid of them. One of the tales I didn't tell in that is it's not just that they drew the districts that way and waited for people who crossed the aisle to disappear. They also drew the districts, each caucus wanted to get rid of the unreliable ones. So they literally ended the political career of those people who had been elected by districts, who were in the middle, who would vote sometimes with your side, and they said, we're going to cut your district so your political career is over. So they literally removed them from the legislature by fiat one fine day. So they didn't wait for them to be retired in the new districts. They actually just got rid of them. And when that happens, it's a problem because I don't think the majority of the legislature should be telling the rest of us, though we've elected a representative, that representative is not worthy to be represented anymore. Yeah.
May I sneak in that second question?
Well, maybe I'll take this gentleman. I'll let you. And if nobody else wants to talk, I'll.
Right. So the assertion is that the top 2 primary is more representative. So if that's the case, have we seen a measurable increase in voter participation?
That is a very good question and a complicated tale. If you look at the figures, and you can look in the paper where I deal with this at length, there has not been an increase in participation in the general electorate, nor has there been an increase or decrease in participation in the primary electorate. That conclusion is difficult to draw for a couple of reasons. One is that the participation goes up and down depending on whether you're in a political or gubernatorial cycle. It's higher for president, lower otherwise. It's complicated by the fact the legislature historically has called special elections at odd times and keeps moving the date of the primary around. But it's complicated by one more profound factor which affects turnout, which is this. Once upon a time in California, when you went to the polls in the primary, one of the things you were voting on were a lot of ballot propositions that had qualified by gathering signatures among the electorate and been put there. One of the ones that, some of these were sometimes very consequential and important. One of them, in fact, was the top 2 primary itself. They're not there anymore. By legislative fiat, they decided that the only time a citizen initiative should be on the general election ballot is in November. June is forbidden. The only thing on the June ballot are things the legislature in its august majesty decides should be there. And they tend to be very controversial things like, do you want to have bonds for veterans or something like that? So you say, gee, if you eliminate all those ballot propositions, all the people that campaigned for them, they're not talking to voters anymore, not spending any money, there's no television. How much money did you yank? And it varies between 80 and 100 or 150 million dollars is no longer being spent on voter contact in the California primaries because those ballot propositions aren't there. So when I say that the participation in the primary has been basically unchanged, it's unchanged in a headwind where somebody has independently removed all that voter contact spending from those primary elections at the same time the top 2 came in. So I can't say, I tend to think it's helped, the top two has helped participation in the primary because it didn't go down. But but I can't prove it, and I can't quantify how much increase in voter participation in terms of turnout there would have been for each $10 million extra you spend in the primary. I can see how much money went away, but I can't quantify the effect. Okay, so take your second wind. Okay.
I guess this question is a little bit bigger than the results themselves, but to me, primaries kind of make sense as like archaic holdovers of a time when parties, ran elections, and parties still sort of do things, even though party labels are becoming more of an identification. Do you see a legitimate utility for party apparatus, or do you see them as sort of just increasingly archaic labels?
Well, I do see a role for political party organizations. I can speak with some authority on this. I've been for the past dozen years actually a voting member of the Republican Central Committee for the Republican Party of Santa Clara. I had the honor of serving as chair for 2 years. And that's a fairly big job because there are 13 U.S. states with fewer voters in it than Santa Clara County, and I was the chair of one of the two political parties, so I've done this. And I've also served as a delegate to the state Republican Party for a dozen years as well. So I've watched what they do. I have my quarrels with my Republican Party, thank you very much. But the fact that citizens use that form of organization to campaign for the legislature they want, I have no quarrel with. I think it's a good thing. I do not, in putting the top two primary forward, have any intention of using it as a club to eliminate political parties or their ability to raise money or talk to voters or what have you. So I think they have a legitimate role, but it doesn't extend so far as to be able to set up a system whereby they can select a small number of voters in the primary and effectively use them to choose which Republican gets to run in a safe seat in order to predetermine the political futures of that system. I don't believe they should have that authority, and currently they don't. This has not made me well-loved in the Republican Party, and it hasn't made me well-loved in the Democratic Party because they would like that authority too. But there is a role for them, yes.
Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, there is no other state with a top two primary.
There are four. There are three other states, sorry.
Okay.
Two with a qualification. Go on.
So sort of a two-part question. One is, has anybody looked at, perhaps you or perhaps somebody else, looked at the pros and cons, the effects of those? And then related to that is which of the, whatever you said, total of four, so out of the 46 remaining states, which ones would benefit the most from going to a top two primary?
Okay. For this, I'm going to call up some graphs. This is my advertising. If you think that some of these that you'd like the answer to some of these questions, now I have to get the right ones. Excuse me a moment. Okay. Why don't you ask your question, nephew, and
if when a state control or when a party controls a particular state,
okay, we want
rules
paper 3 figures.
So my question: do you think it's like matters when you're trying to make a
Yes.
particular state there to try to do another state with the opposite party control kind of and balance out the population? Obviously, if you converted all the only states from a certain party to top two, that would be skewing effect on the whole country. That wasn't necessarily increasing it. So like when you put it work in tandem or like which of the other states have done it, and is there any way to balance that to get people on board to do it? Is only bringing California to the water without like
Well, okay. Again, I don't think it's made California more moderate, except in the form that it's made its government more representative. Okay. That being the case, let me turn back to the other question for a moment. I'll come back to yours momentarily. Okay. actually, that one, I'll take that one first. Okay. So the question was asked, what about all the primary systems in all the other 50 states? And what you see here is, for one particular election year, what the primary systems are for the 50 states. If you look really sharp, that's a 2-letter abbreviation for Louisiana. So the 50 states are represented by the standard 2-letter abbreviations. The horizontal axis is the kind of primary they have. There are states that have a top 2 primary. It's Nebraska, oddly enough, for its legislature, has a top 2 primary, California, Washington State, and Louisiana. They're partisan primaries, but they vary depending on various questions about how open or closed they are. A closed primary says, if you're declined to state, you can't vote in this primary by law. Go away, you bother me. A partially closed primary will allow them under some circumstances and so forth. Some states have open primaries. A lot of these come from the South. They have what are called pick-a-party primaries, meaning on election day you show up and you say, I'd like to vote the Democratic ballot today or the Republican ballot today. But once you pick the Republican ballot today, you only get Republicans to vote for. But they're open to anybody. Anybody can take them. They're totally open. If you're an independent voter, you can still vote in the primaries. So what you're seeing here is the scatter. So there's a wide range of these things. One of the interesting questions that gets asked is in the primary system is, well, does the top 2, ruin us? In terms of the fact we have these D versus R, DD and RR races. That's costing us a lot of D versus R races, right? That's bad. But what do the other states do with D versus R races? So on the left-hand graph is the fraction of the races for the state legislature which end in races with D versus R. Okay, so what you're seeing over here is that in this election year, the state of Pennsylvania only had half of them. Okay. In other states, Michigan way at the top, it's breaking the upper line, actually had 100% of its legislative districts with D versus R. And some states like Mississippi, the number that end in D versus R is only like 5 or 10%. So in fact, the general rule is D versus R races are actually no better than 50% on average across the entire nation. And there's a lot of scatter among them. So some are really could get a lot and some get a lot. Now California is the blue thing in this column. All right, so we're way up there in D versus R with the top 2. We're not suffering in D versus R. And let's see, can I move this over? I think I'm going to need you. I don't know quite which one to do. All right. Yeah, okay. And you can ask longitudinally how this works. Across the United States, there are 5,800 offices, state legislatures. Okay? This is the fraction of D versus R general elections that wind up over the decades, all the time from 2002 to 2016. That's all. Okay? So what you're finding out is for the United States in general, maybe 60% you get D versus R. The other ones, one of the parties just decides to stay home. And there are a lot of uncompetitive legislative races. And most of these are separate primary states where, after all, if the Republicans are guaranteed a slot in the ballot and there's no Republican in the general election, the only way that can happen is that no Republican even chose to file. So if you wanted to run somebody, you could do it, but it doesn't happen. So in California, we've been bobbling along. With partisan primaries, we're in the 90s, and now that we're in 2012, it splits into 2 things. How many times you contested in the primary, and how many times you contest in the general. So the drop shows you the DDs and the RRs. But even with the drop, we're way ahead of most states. So it's really not much of an argument to say, we got these you're getting these DD and RR races. It must be bad for democracy intrinsically, because if that's true, you've got 49 other states which have severe problems and have had them for close to 15 years, as far back as the study has been done. The man who actually did this study, whose data I'm presenting, just hasn't gone farther back than that. Very interesting thing about very interesting thing.
Just clarify for me the national.
I'll get back to you.
Is this law for national representatives? Is it legal for us to change the law to make it national, the top two, or is it a constitutional amendment of the nation?
Well, it's by state, like all the primary systems.
So we could have top two for our national representatives.
Oh, well, we have it for the U.S. House now in California,
Okay,
and for the United States Senate. We have that.
Okay.
If you want to make it national in the sense that every 50 states has to do it this way, it's a different question. Each state can, exactly. Okay. Oh, yes, I remember. Okay. Yeah, generally. Well, half of them, because the turnout in the general election is twice what in the general. So when you have, say, a three-candidate flip a coin Democratic primary, the people who are deciding which of the two Democrats go in there are not only, first of all, you get twice as many Democrats voting here, and they didn't vote in the primary. To them, these candidates are new, and nobody knows where their votes are going to go. Then there's the guy who was defeated, and his supporters say, well, okay, which one of them do I want? So you get a chunk of the Democratic primary vote that weighs in. Then you get the independents and the Republicans all saying, well, we belong to this district too. We evidently we don't agree with Democrats on a whole bunch of things. And we're not going to be able to win any of those battles no matter which one of these guys wins, but there may be some differences that we care about. So in some things, we may be able to exert some influence, which is appropriate for a minority party. It's kind of how it works.
But I guess, even so, like, if the representation is more so in
Well, I don't think for the top two, I don't think it matters. That my state becomes more representative is not so much a thing. It really matters when you deal with redistricting reform, because you can change the partisan balance in Congress, and both parties are trying to do this by saying, in my states, I'm going to gerrymander the districts to win extra seats, and in the states that are controlled by your party in the legislature, I want fair districts. I want them competitive. I want all of this. And so if I were trying to do redistricting form in clusters of states, I personally would try to balance them by saying, look, I understand, there are 10 House seats here, 10 House seats there, and you can steal 8 by gerrymander, and they can steal 8 by gerrymander. That still adds up to 10 seats each. So how about if we don't gerrymander at all and run a campaign so that if one of the parties tries to keep their state out from being reformed, that's where the resources go to make sure that they can't do that. But no one's asked me. Yeah.
Do you have an explanation or a speculation as to why the California Republican Party has chosen to perpetuate the conflation of an election to nominate candidates with the conflation to seat people in office, or why they haven't chosen to undertake the nomination of their own candidates on their own part, rather than having that be part of a public election?
Okay. First of all, the Republican Party does nominate its candidates by convention and by other means. In fact, as I've actually done this because I've been a county party chair, we nominate our candidates and we tell which ones we choose. And in the state party, we do the same thing. The difference with the top two is that nomination does not mean that the guy that we want to fight for as a party organization necessarily is the Republican who is, we can fight for him in the primary, but he may lose. And more to the point, if there are 2 in the general election, we can fight for him, and some other Republican may win it anyway.
Amend that framework a little bit. So then why would then the nomination occur after the primary election?
Generally, it occurred, okay, I'm not in charge of this in the Republican Party. When I was there, those discussions were had before the primary elections, just in order to influence them. I am not currently a delegate, so I have not been following the intra-party politics. So you may know more about it than I do about when they do. I knew they moved up the primary. I do know that the board of directors of the Republican Party has been confirming county party selections of Republican Party nominees in these various districts. So there is a process, but I'm not currently part of it. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Sounds plausible hypothesis, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Let me run through this. First of all, we had one, in the years that I was studying this, we had one top two D on D statewide race of great consequence, which was the Kamala Harris, Loretta Sanchez senatorial race. And so I looked at all the races in district races, Assembly, Senate, Congress, and asked, can you see, are the Republicans voting less often than the Democrats? And the answer is no. There's no difference between the likelihood of a Republican or a Democrat voting in a DD or an RR election for Assembly, Senate. I can't find it. Okay. That is not to say that your question, which is, because in effect, the top of the ticket in California, functionally, I believe, is governor, if you have one, U.S. president, if you don't. So while it is true we had lots of statewide races that were DD in 2016, you had a Republican running for president. And in fact, I think that anchors it. I have no idea what would happen if you had a D on D gubernatorial race. I have no idea what would happen if you didn't have a Republican nominee for president. I'm not going that far. But there's no evidence that running D on D statewide has changed the voter participation in these critical district races. It isn't there. It's a plausible idea, but it's not there. I have to qualify this a little bit. I said district races. If you look at the Sanchez-Harris race, you can actually look and see whether you got more voter turnout in heavily Republican districts or heavily Democratic districts, and you can actually see Republicans voted less often in that D on D race than Democrats did. Democrats were more likely to vote in that statewide race than a Republican was. The Republican participation was still enough to change the election day totals by 14%. So it's not like it had no influence, but it had not enough influence to put that race in doubt. So, but in that same election cycle, there is no corresponding effect in the district races. Namely, the Republicans might have gone to that particular D on D race and said, when I come to my ballot, I just skip it. I don't know, I don't care. But when they came to the district races, for Assembly, Senate, and Congress, they faithfully voted. So it can be a complicated tale looking at the actual voter participation to see what is happening.
I was wondering about your view on collective action problems that might happen out of this when a party can't control how many candidates are running on their side of the aisle. So, perfect example is Pete Aguilar's seat in 2012. There was, I think, around 6 Democratic candidates and only 2 or 3 Republicans. Yeah. They split their vote so much, a seat that should have was even leaning left ended up representing by a Republican for at least one term. And in the next cycle, Democrats were able to control the number of candidates on their side at least enough that one was able to make it on to the top 2. So how do you view that collective action problem when parties can't necessarily stop the number of candidates because they don't have primaries?
It's a legitimate problem. Of the 80 races that end in same-party general elections, that's the only one where you've got a same party race, in this case R versus R, in a district where the voter registration leaned Democratic by, if I remember correctly, about 6 points. And the reason it did so is the Republicans ran 2 candidates, the Democrats ran 3. The Democrats divided up their support enough that the 2 Republicans' support divided between 2 instead of 3 was enough to actually tease it out. That happens. Okay, it's happened once now in 4 election cycles in the state of California. No election system is perfect, and that is an admitted flaw, which in fact is analyzed in this paper. I have 2 responses to it. One is, if you have that problem, the historical evidence is it's corrected in the next election cycle. So 2 years, you got the wrong party, but the next year, boom. What happens if you get the wrong incumbent in Congress? Got 2 Democrats, but unfortunately you sent the guy who should have been there, lost in the primary, got the wrong one. Don't worry, we can fix it. It just takes a little time for a same-party challenge to fix it. People in Congress do lose same-party races. Do you know what the length of time you have to wait for a typical congressman to be challenged and lose in a primary in the United States? 200 years. Okay? You got a handful of people who lose in partisan primary things. So I have a problem that, yes, it happens, but it happened in 80 of these top 2 races. It was healed over the next election cycle, but I've got, if all those people run for Congress, they didn't, but, call it 10 or 12 member top 2 races for Congress. I've got the right guy. And if I'd gotten the wrong guy, I'd have to wait 200 years to try to fix it. That's a trade-off I'm personally willing to make. Avoiding that kind of problem is why people like ranked choice voting and putting 3 candidates in the primary. If you'd done that, you would have gotten a Democrat in, and then he would have cleaned the Republicans' clock, likely. And then that wouldn't have happened. It's not a big enough problem to invalidate the top 2, but it's a big enough problem that I'm looking seriously at ranked choice voting in the general election.
Well, we are out of time, so please join me in thanking Charlie for this fascinating talk.